Welcome viewers, Dr. JWA here, theologist since 1994. We're dealing with the subject, the life of Muhammad and the verified revelation structure of the people of the book. We've made it to episode 14, relatively unscathed I'd imagine. And we're going to look at the psychology of submission within the Islamic ideology structure. And in the previous episode, fear of separation began carrying psychological, relational and existential consequence as belonging, identity and emotional stability became increasingly fused to preservation of the Islamic ideological structure itself. And viewers, in this episode, obedience begins moving deeper than behaviour alone. It begins moving into theological conditioning, radicalisation. Because once fear, belonging, identity, authority and emotional survival stabilise together long enough, submission to the Islamic ideology no longer functions merely as external compliance. It increasingly becomes internalized psychological governance. And viewers, at first, that process rarely appears dramatic externally. Usually it feels reasonable, orderly, protective, even morally necessary inside the ideology, but especially inside environments where obedience feels virtuous, loyalty feels righteous, unity feels sacred, and disagreement feels dangerous, even catastrophic, because once those emotional associations stabilise deeply enough within the Muslim, the nervous system gradually begins linking submission itself, submission to the Islamic ideology itself, to emotional safety. And that mechanism becomes extraordinarily important because the Muslim is no longer merely obeying outward expectations. The Muslim increasingly begins regulating their thoughts, their questions, their reactions, their doubts, emotional responses, behavioural boundaries before external authority, before the authorities of the Islamic ideology in the area that they're in even intervenes directly. So, viewers, that's where behavioural governance becomes deeply internalised, psychologically, spiritually, relationally and existentially. Not merely through visible rules within the Islamic ideology structure, through conditioned anticipation living under those rules. The room teaches before correction arrives, one might say. The atmosphere shapes before discipline becomes visible. And eventually many Muslims begin instinctively protecting the emotional stability of the Islamic ideological structure because deeper stabilization itself now feels psychologically unsafe internally. For the Muslim, the pressure deepens there. Self-monitoring intensifies earlier. Questions become emotionally exhausting faster. Silence begins feeling responsible. Obedience begins feeling stabilizing. And over time, the Muslim quietly begins noticing something important. The Islamic ideology system no longer requires constant visible enforcement once the nervous system itself begins carrying the structure internally. And that mechanism appears repeatedly throughout authority history, especially inside theological systems where identity is collective, authority is moralized, belonging is conditional, and uncertainty feels destabilizing. Because once the Muslim's emotional safety becomes psychologically fused to obedience to the Islamic ideology itself, discernment often begins narrowing automatically long before conscious suppression is even recognized. The Qur'an repeatedly reinforces obedience, submission, and allegiance structures surrounding Allah and the Messenger, Muhammad. Quran 4:6-5 reads, chapter 4, verse 65, "But know, by your Lord, they will not truly believe until they make you, O Muhammad, judge concerning that over which they dispute among themselves." And that kind of radical conditioning, religious radicalism, that conditioning pressure matters enormously here, viewers, because once the Muslim's obedience begins functioning psychologically as emotional stabilization, disagreement no longer feels like intellectual caution alone. It increasingly feels internally disruptive. And the Muslim now risks emotional instability itself by continuing unresolved examination too deeply. The internal conflict becomes extraordinarily powerful because the Muslim often experiences the discomfort of personal anxiety rather than recognizing how deeply behavioural conditioning, the ideological radicalism, behavioural conditioning has already shaped the atmosphere surrounding inquiry itself. And for the Muslim, the nervous system adapts silently there. Acceptance to the ideology brings relief. Agreement restores calm. Certainty reduces tension. Belonging restores emotional equilibrium. And eventually, many Muslims begin unconsciously avoiding unresolved questions, simply to recover psychological stability inside the Islamic ideological structure again. And that reciprocal reinforcement cycle becomes one of the strongest invisible stabilizers within the Islamic ideological authority system. Not merely through punishment, not merely through emotional regulation, but through the complete control of the person, of the Muslim's life itself. Because now obedience is no longer functioning merely as behaviour of choice. It increasingly functions as relief. And that distinction matters enormously, especially once the ideology structure itself becomes emotionally associated with safety, certainty, identity, belonging, meaning, and existential order for the Muslim. Yet, beneath the emotional stabilization, in harmonizing with the Islamic ideology lifestyle, the unresolved question still remains. Then it remains standing, unresolved. Does Muhammad's emerging Islamic ideology revelation structure truly align with the already established authoritative prophetic witness carried among the people of the book? Or has the Muslim been conditioned to psychological submission progressively and begun protecting allegiance to the Islamic ideology before continuity testing has fully concluded? And viewers, that distinction remains critically important because throughout biblical revelation structure, obedience never removed the obligation of discernment, of examination, of verification, of continuity testing and examination against prior revelation. And we find this in the book of Acts, where the Bereans examined claims carefully against Scripture rather than surrendering discernment to emotional relief or authority expectation or collective pressure or conditioned psychological stability. And that pattern matters enormously now, viewers, because verified revelation survives scrutiny without requiring psychological dependence or conditioned fear or emotional regulation loops or internalized behavioural governance mechanisms to preserve obedience. And once emotional relief itself becomes fused to submission, discernment often narrows silently long before the Muslim fully recognise how deeply the atmosphere has already conditioned their willingness to continue examining unresolved questions openly. And that's Islamic ideological captivity. I'm Dr. J.W.A. theologist since 1994. I'm going to ask you to like and subscribe to encourage the channel to continue. Press the bell if you like the content. Comment to educate me. And share the video to give yourself a sense of helping somebody else and actually helping somebody else. Viewers, in the next episode, I'm going to move into the cost of doubt within the Islamic ideological system and structure. Because once submission becomes psychologically stabilizing, unresolved certainty itself increasingly begins carrying emotional, relational, and existential penalties inside the ideological structure. So until then, bye for now.